Have you heard about the idea of degrowth? Have you considered what it means in a modern society like Australia, maybe the US, UK, Western Europe? What does it mean to live sustainably? Do you have to give stuff up? What can we do to actually reduce the footprint we have on the planet? How many people can live on the planet without us continuing to bugger it up? If you've ever thought about any of those things, you'll enjoy the conversation I had with Martin Tye about degrowth. There was a bit of grumpy Grant in this, maybe a bit of extremist Grant in this. Martin certainly got some very interesting points of view, and I thought it was worthwhile bringing them to the Bird Emergency audience. I hope you enjoy this, and I'd be really interested in your comments. So, of course, the best way to get me through the comments is on the website, and this post will be thebirdemergency.com/degrowth, or you can hit me up on Twitter or Mastodon. You can find all the links. I'm at Bird Emergency. But hey, leave a comment here or on your podcast app of choice, or on the YouTube, thebirdemergency.com/YouTube. Of course, subscribe there. Anyway, enough waffle from me. Remember, if you're into the show, thebirdemergency.com/coffee, that really helps me out. G'day, Bird Emergency fans, conservation people, and those of you interested in a smaller but still pretty great Australia. I'm the host and producer of this amazing show. Yes, you can giggle. See this behind me, everyone? A lot of people would think that is a beautiful sight, but no, that's a degraded landscape, and a degraded landscape is not a good thing. But it's all tied up in the subject of today's discussion, and I'd love to bring on my guest, Martin Tye. How are you, Martin?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Look, it's a pleasure, Martin. Now, you may be familiar with Martin on Twitter, where he talks regularly about the issue, the concept of degrowth. And I see a lot of people getting very heated when degrowth is mentioned, and a whole lot of people talk about the ruination of our society if we pursue degrowth. So I invited Martin on to actually talk about what is it. And during the discussion, I'll obviously be giving my thoughts about my gut feeling about it. And those of you who follow the show know that I'm going to be an advocate for degrowth, because I subscribe to the idea that we live on a planet that has sustainable, finite resources, and that you cannot continually grow. And even basic economics should tell you this. If there's only so much stuff and you are using it to do something, in the end, you're going to have no more stuff unless you are using the stuff that you've already used to make new stuff. So I think that's where I have a problem with this whole endless growth. But Martin, why don't you start by telling...
Oh, sorry, Grant. Can you hear me? I've lost sound. I have no sound. I have no sound.
Have you got me now?
Oh, I've got you now, but you just dropped out there.
No, I just got a little thing saying your computer has lost connection to your mic. I don't know what happened there. So let me ask you.
I was trying to lip read, but I couldn't quite get there. Something about you wanting an ice cream or something, was it?
I think, thanks, Naomi. Naomi's just said she can't hear me. No, I don't know what caused that. Gang, that's why I need to do a crowdfunding to get a new computer. I pushed this little thing to its limits, and it's obviously given up on that. But we're back. So let me do that intro again for you, Martin. I invited Martin on the show to give me an idea of what the concept of degrowth really is, and then how we can look to achieving it. And I'd like to frame the discussion in all the things about what's possible, both in a economic and scientific framework, but also in real politics. So, Martin, welcome. Thanks for coming on the show. Can you give us an idea of what got you interested in degrowth as a concept, and what are your skills in terms of analysing it and getting your opinion out there?
I think for most of us in this movement, our initial interest springs from a deep love of and concern for nature. When you see everything being destroyed and being fed into the growth machine, and you start to look for alternatives. So I guess originally it was just that whole watching our bushland disappear, watching our oceans get plundered, and all the while our politicians claiming growth off the back of all this plunder just made me really angry. So I got involved. Look, I'm from a small business background, so I think that connects me to some of the realities of the flawed economic model. But I got involved maybe 10 or 12 years ago. I stood for politics. I got involved via partly the population issue, but partly also it's all tied up together. The wasteful overconsumption I see, and all that being rewarded by what I see as a fundamentally flawed economic system. So that's what got me into it. I guess at the root of it is a concern for both nature and for, I've got 2 boys. I want them to have a future, and I don't like seeing it being devoured for short-term profits.
So let's start with the first problem. What do you see in our Western society? We'll try and keep it fairly broad. Australia's got some special sort of problems that some other Western countries don't have. But what do you see is the greatest issue with the way we live our lives? And is there one thing that we need to fix first? Is there a number one imperative?
If you want to put a number one imperative, I'd say addressing the question of unsustainable scale. But I think we have to be really careful about looking for like ordering things and saying, we just need to do this. We see it with climate change. We just need to fix that. But while we're looking so hard at that, all sorts of stuff's happening behind our backs that can pose an equal threat. So I see a holistic response and a system which embraces that holistic response. I don't think you can break it down and say, let's deal with this and then let's deal with that, because we need to deal with it all together and all within a system. And degrowth is the system. Degrowth to steady state. I don't know if I've mentioned yet. I represent the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. I'm one of their regional directors here in Australia. And steady state economics is basically the idea of an economy that recognises the limits to growth and operates it's within safe ecological limits. And within that, it can be quite dynamic and all sorts of things can happen, good things, but without destroying the planet. I think that's the framework we need to consider all the other actions within.
Can we achieve degrowth while maintaining the same standard of living in the advanced economies of the OECD?
Well, that's a great question. I'd like to precede that question with, can we maintain those standards of living with growth? And the current growth economic model is not maintaining those standards so it's not like we've got a choice of a good thing versus something that's risky. Current system's failing. We're seeing the wealth accumulating at the top and a sort of a bottom-up creep of people doing it tough, from poor people right through to the middle class, where it's working its way up. Let's just say for a start that the current system is failing and that failure is accelerating. Can we maintain our current standard of living? We cannot maintain our current rate of consumption. You create your standard of living around materialism and things like that. Definitely not. That has to be reduced. But can we have a better standard of living with less consumption? I think we can, if we reconnect with nature and find new ways to seek meaning.
One of the things that I find in this discussion about growth, and particularly in terms of climate change, and we'll get to teasing out how I think for political expedience, a lot of people are conflating climate change with acting on biodiversity and the extinction crisis, but that's a different conversation. But I think we often frame this question of doing the right thing for the planet from a Western standpoint, but without really thinking about it, we start telling people who do not enjoy our standard of living that they need to not aspire to our standard of living for the good of the planet. Do you see where I'm going with that one?
Yeah, I do. And really, at the end of the day, the goal must be a more equitable world. And so to achieve that, a key component in that is that the wasteful overconsumption that we see happening in the developed world, although I always make the point the developed world's not uniform and we have plenty of poverty and suffering within our own.
Oh, certainly. And it's growing.
And this idea that the developed world is homogenized group of people that are all living fantastic, own a house on a jet ski, that's not quite true. But what I'm getting at is that you have to hold a vision of what sort of world you're aspiring to. And I don't think we have a vision at the moment. It's just grow and hope that the growth system will deliver it. And we don't even know what it's planning to deliver. But yes, we don't want to see people in poverty, but to move them up from poverty increases their ecological impact and resource impact and the waste production. There's no doubt about that. That's just comes with the territory. So then we have to look at the numbers, the population issue, what the planet can sustain at what level. And it gets quite frightening when you consider that we've got over 8 billion people on the earth at the moment. And in my view, even if the West backs substantially, it's just an ecological impossibility to bring them all up even to middle class because there just aren't the resources. So there's a lot of comments come into this. One of them is the much neglected population issue. That's what I mean by a holistic response. If you do one thing like reduce Western consumption without addressing other factors, then you're not going to succeed. So we need to put it all together within a system that's DeGrowth aiming to reduce the aggregate ecological impact across the planet.
It's a really difficult issue to have a honest conversation with yourself about, I find, Martin. I'd be interested in your thoughts about this because whenever reducing population gets raised, people get hysterical about it, but there is a real difficult issue to confront. And that is if we think that we have already got to or exceeded a sustainable population for the earth, if we accept that, and I don't know whether you do, but let me just put that out. If we say we have already reached the ceiling, the next question inevitably is, who's off? Who dies?
Yeah. I get that all the time. First of all, that ceiling is a function of two things. It's a function of how people live and how many. So the ecological ceiling is determined by those two things. If you want to offer everyone on Earth a modest middle class life with a home and a refrigerator and maybe a car or a scooter or something, personal transport, those basics, middle class, not talking about extravagance, then when you times that by over 8 billion, we're just way over. But when it comes down to managing that, there is a very good organisation that I'd recommend to your listeners in the UK called Population Matters. And they have a solutions page, and it basically comes back to education, family planning, empowerment of women, funding for contraception, these sorts of things. At the moment, we have a system, and sometimes it's patriarchal cultural trends in certain countries, and sometimes it's just the economic system that demands more consumers. But at the moment, all the messages going out, like we've just seen China's population stabilize, perhaps slightly reduced, but it's being cast as catastrophic. Now, that should be cast as a good news story. So when the themes being issued from on high are that this is good, we now can share the resources among a more stable number of people or even less people. That means each get a greater share of the resources. When that sort of message comes out, I don't think you need to take any drastic actions. People are smart. But at the moment, they're being told all the wrong things. They're saying growth and Australia needs growth to fuel the economy so people can sell more goods and we can blah, blah, blah. So the message that comes from our leaders is all wrong. The message has been hijacked by those, in my view, with a vested interest, substantial financial vested interests in business as usual, which hinges on this growth. So I think that issue can be handled very sensitively and very ethically. And I think what's happening now is unethical. We're denying people access to education, family planning, contraception, all the things they need to improve their lot. That's being withheld because either we don't want to touch the issue or because we're so addicted to growth that we don't want to see populations stabilize, heaven forbid, reduce. So the population issue is very sensitive, and I think it's been tainted, and I think the message has been influenced by those that are profiting from it. Let's put it that way.
There's a nice segue for me. Thanks, Martin. I think it was Oxfam that put out, it's a number of years ago now, a study. They did a study, and I think it was 25 or 28 individuals in the world control the equivalent resources that 80% of the population of the world control. So that seems bonkers to begin with. And population and economic well-being for those who at the top, often influenced by the people who control the capital, but also the other great controller of societies, which is religion. So how can we move towards rejigging what those basic belief systems in, maybe if we just said the top 20 population centers in the world, how can we move towards it without people feeling threatened about their basic belief systems that then trigger off all sorts of other bad actions like conflict, like armed conflict for a start, or persecution of people with viewpoints that might be eminently sensible? History is littered with examples of purges of people who think one way, only for that thing to become the dominant paradigm 100 years down the track.
Yeah, if I disappear after this interview, you can maybe dump me among one of those.
Oops, the deep state's already got you.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Look, I wish I knew the answer about how we could get these important messages about different paradigms, different ways of thinking, different ways of behaving. I wish I knew how to get it out there. I've been plugging away. I've just cracked 10,000 followers on Twitter, which is something, but it's nothing compared to the influence that mainstream media and so on has over people's minds. All I can do, my strategy is basically twofold: to point out the flaws in the current system and try to make people understand where it's taking us, and to try to present the case for a different system, and just hope enough people get on board that at some point, because history is also littered with great moments of awareness and great social advancement and enlightenment. So we can only hope that once things, maybe the bad gets so bad and the good looks so good, that the balance suddenly tips, the seesaw tips. And that's my hope. I wouldn't be putting too much money on it anytime soon. I don't really see it happening. And in fact, I'm seeing the vested interest that those wealthy that you're talking about tighten control. So I don't know if you've got to try, haven't you? I have a saying that you can always make things better than they would otherwise have been had you done nothing. And that kind of motivates me to people say, oh, you're not going to make any difference, but maybe I can make it just a bit better than it might have been if I didn't try. If enough of us get out there and talk and speak about these things, then who knows what can happen? You never know.
I want to challenge you to something, Martin, if you don't mind. And it's probably a bit unfair that I do this, but I'm sure you'll accept this challenge. When I speak to people about the idea of degrowth, not even how we do it, just the idea of degrowth, people often say to me, oh, yeah, we've all seen Soylent Green. Do you remember that movie?
Oh, yeah.
Where they got excess people and put them into a big mincer and turned them into biscuits to feed the world. Let's just say I pulled in a fella or a woman who runs a small manufacturing business in Australia, and it uses resources that are unsustainably produced, and then it produces something which is essentially a product that is useless in an overarching sense, but also has a whole heap of other things that we don't need, 2 or 3 wrappings, and it is delivered in a way that creates 3 or 4 journeys that don't need to be had. How do you broach change with someone who is in their well-being and their family's well-being is intrinsically involved in exploitation and working against the concept of degrowth?
That's where strong government comes into it. And what happens is that if an industry that's unproductive and exploitative gets given too much license, it becomes so rich and powerful that it has the power to, via donations or whatever, to corrupt politics. So I think it comes back to, again, sounds like a totally fanciful idea, free thinking, independent, strong politicians who are willing to take the bigger view. And for example, you could easily introduce a range of, say, environmental levies, or where in some countries it's been proposed that where our that perhaps our manufacturing is outcompeted by a country that uses child labour. You could have social levies on imports. But at the moment, we're just committed to getting things from wherever as cheaply as possible. If, for example, if it was whether it was local or international, if somebody is doing something, they need to pay. They shouldn't be getting free use of the commons and free exploitation or commercial benefit from exploitation of people. So if I was the Prime Minister or the President or whatever, there'd be levies coming in, and they would be saying, okay, you're destroying that bushland. You don't do it for free. And as the bushland disappears, the price on our bushland would go up for your bird habitats and for all sorts of reasons. And so we have economic levers. If our purpose was to redirect industry and business into more sustainable practices, you could easily turn the profit motive and potential for development into different spheres, different things. But at the moment, it's just open splatter. The environment costs you nothing to use, nothing to pour your rubbish into, and nothing to bulldoze, or next to nothing, trivial amounts I see sometimes. But so, yes, that's how you could redirect the entrepreneurial spirit, but that you've got to set the rules, and the rules they're no longer a free use of the planet or the land as an input into your business model, or not free, but cheap or unrealistically cheap, whatever.
I have a bit of a problem when we try and tie good outcomes for nature to an economic valuation of nature, because then I would see maybe Musk and Bezos then go and buy every piece of intact habitat that there is on the free market. And then it becomes valuable if there's any kind of credit if there's some kind of swap or offset plan for people who feel like they necessarily need to clear land to do something productive with. So then you would have rich people gaining control of the natural resources that they would be willing to trade for a high enough price for people to continue to exploit. So
I see what you're saying.
So I have a real problem with commodifying nature. I don't know if we can move past that without getting to the point of just basically saying it's not okay to stuff things up anymore. That seems to be where I land here, that nobody's a hero if they encourage continuing bad practice.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is, and I wasn't advocating offsets but what I'm trying to say is that if it's no longer economically viable for somebody, say a property developer that comes in and just bulldozes the bush and sticks in a massive subdivision, if they had to say, let's not say pay for the nature, let's say they had to pay for the infrastructure needed to support development. Yeah. The hospital, the schools, the roads, the sewer, the water, the new dam that's got to be built to provide water. If they had to properly fund that instead of constantly being shifted onto the taxpayer, then their biz model would become unviable and they wouldn't do it. You can avoid the price, as you say, the forests and the trees, but you can turn growth back to the actual pure economics, and the sort of growth we're pursuing at the moment is a net loser. And that's evidenced by the fact that we're having to sell off public assets. And for example, hospital beds per thousand are declining all the time. Our roads are becoming worse. Everything's getting overloaded. So even if you left nature out of it, there's too much of a free ride for unsustainable business practices under the current model because they fuel growth. You bulldoze the bush, put in a housing development. Yes, you've got economic growth, but you've got a weaker economy and you've got people that are worse off. And then there's the ecological side as well as the economic side. So you could come at it from the economic side and leave nature out of it if you wanted to. And then you would see that many of the highly profitable business practices today would not be profitable if they had to actually pay their fair share.
You've just used the example of a new development, a subdivision, and I want to pursue that a little bit more, perhaps in a broader sense. Most of the wealth that most Australians will accrue in their lifetime are tied up in two things. One is compulsory superannuation, that we can debate the pros and cons of that. But the other main driver of wealth for individuals and for families in this country is the acquisition of real estate, of property. And for most people, it's their one house, their principal dwelling, and that most people increase their wealth by selling one property that they live in and acquiring another one. And the increase in the value of that property over time is what gets their wealth.
Can I make a point on that?
Absolutely.
Doesn't so much hold when people buying and selling their own home, because you buy and sell on the same market. So you're not really increasing wealth if you sell a house today and move into another one tomorrow. It's when people have investment properties, which is a non-productive business venture, because that's what it is. People invest in investment properties, which drives house prices up and which makes homes more difficult for actual people to live in and their own home. So I don't have a problem with people buying their own home, but
no, I'll just stop you there, because I don't have a problem with people buying their own home. What I have a problem with is that the concept of wealth, it generally is involved in the increase of the value of that property, which in the broad terms in the economy produces nothing tangible. So it's not real wealth. It's as real as the value of Bitcoin, right? It's just because we believe it's valuable. How do we move away from this? Because our whole economy is based around in one form or another. The buying and the loans, home loans, investment loans are all based around property. And this new construction is all based around property.
Yeah.
And we're never pushing the idea that we should develop more. And actually, I've got criticisms for a lot of real natural allies in this space. I often see people whose opinions I greatly value also saying the developer down the road shouldn't be allowed to turn such and such into 10 apartments. But there's a disconnect, isn't there, in that if you don't want people to be bulldozing koala habitat on the southwest fringe of Sydney, then some of those lovely old properties that have been developed in the inner city might need to become multi-unit dwellings.
There's an assumption there, and that is the assumption that we continue with the population Ponzi economy. And the way that works is it creates a set of costs. So in order to pay those costs, you have to sell more land or upgrade or densify more land to pay for those costs. And then you build that, and then you've got a bigger set of costs. So you've got to bring in more into what we call the population Ponzi economy. So it keeps growing that way. Now, whether you densify or sprawl, even if you densify, the ecological footprint still spreads.
That's right. It's still damaging. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, what we're doing in Australia at the moment is both. We're densifying and sprawling, and that's the absolute nightmare scenario for the environment. So the third option there is to say, hang on, what if we were to stabilize? Then we wouldn't need to do either. Stabilize our population, and we won't do that while our goal is economic growth. Population growth is the key driver of economic growth. So the whole idea of degrowth is to take the wind out of all these sails, all these unsustainable, damaging sails, because there is a sort of sense that if we densify, yes, we're stopping sprawl into the bushland, but we're still going to need more food. We're still going to need more resources. We're still going to need more water, more sewage, more consumer goods, everything. It makes a fairly small difference, yes. But then again, how long do we go on densifying and getting people into ever higher dog boxes? In the rush to do it, we're not even doing it in a measured way. We're getting dodgy builds and people living in ever smaller and smaller apartments. So the whole process that we're engaging in at the moment, all driven by the imperative for economic growth, is just leading us into bad places everywhere, ecologically, socially, economically. It's all leading us into bad places. So that the degrowth argument would be that if we weren't expanding, and if in fact we could bring ourselves to consciously shrink back, because where we are now, say in Australia, is massively into ecological overshoot. We are destroying our land to sustain what we've got now, and yet we're still aiming for growth. If we could bring ourselves to think this way, that we were going to, as a country, consciously shrink and shrink our ecological footprint, shrink our economy, then these problems of whether people live in ever higher apartment towers or urban sprawl wouldn't be. We could focus on making better cities and better planning and giving back some land to nature and farmland that's been paved over, we would have a different set of issues, but they would be much easier and better issues to tackle.
So if I sent out some invitations to a couple of people to join our conversation and they accepted, and Anthony Albanese jumped into our conversation right now, what would be the couple of most important things that you would want him to begin campaigning on for change?
I think probably the single biggest thing in the degrowth movement, as I see it, is to change. They say you are what you measure. And at the moment, we measure progress, development, growth, call it what you will, purely through the GDP figure, which is essentially the size of the economy. And the goal is, the assumption is, as long as that's growing, as long as that figure is growing, that all is good, all will be well. The economy's growing, everything's sweet. If we were to adopt a broader set of performance indicators, some ecological, social, and social ones might be things like affordable housing, how many homes we have. Ecological might refer to our emissions or to land clearing. If we adopted a different set of indicators and measured performance differently, then the true state of what's going on would be revealed. And we would see that although GDP is growing and technically according to money value, we're not in recession, but everything else is in recession. Our environment, our living conditions, our health system, our education system, everything's in recession, but GDP is growing. So if Mr. Albanese was sitting here right now, I'd say, mate, we've got to change GDP and we've got to develop a broader set of performance indicators. And our goal has to be to see them improving. And if that means GDP has to go down, if there's a correlation between shrinking GDP and environmental restoration, then so be it. It's more important. If there's no economy on a dead planet, mate. Sorry, is he listening? Are you there?
No, but I'm waiting for Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak to pop in. But first, I think we're of a similar age. I always out myself. In 1982, I took a subject called environmental science in year 11, and the big theme of that subject that came with a very expensive, I remember it was in a US textbook I had to buy, it was $130 then.
Whoa.
So it was super expensive. Triple bottom line. The world was moving towards accounting for the detrimental effects that society has on the natural world. And the triple bottom line was the thing. What happened?
Where did it go?
What happened?
I'll tell you what happened is there was just too much money tied up in economic growth, and triple bottom line accounting for environmental costs threatened those business models. And that's why so many important issues have been swept under the table and it's now we've been made to believe that it's all about economic growth, even though I think most people listening or watching would look around their world and see that everything's going backwards. And yet they still have this unbreakable blind faith in economic growth as the one and only system. And I think it's squashed all those meaningful debates and good ideas that we've had over the years, even perhaps things like moving from fossil fuels to other energy sources, because those energy sources place limits on growth because they cannot provide the same scale as fossil fuels could. So all of these things have been corrupted by economic growth and what I call the planetary parasites that have attached themselves to it. I have no time for them whatsoever.
Okay. I want you to name names in a minute. Okay. Because I like that label, but there's a couple of questions I want to get to before we go for the planetary parasites. First, let's double them up. I'll get your thoughts on two of them in a minute. Who are the heroes in the degrowth space? I can't really think of anyone who is a well-known environmentalist, someone who's widely recognized for being part of the environmental movement, who is brave enough to attach themselves to the degrowth model. So put that one in your back pocket.
Yeah.
The other difficult one is, can we actually have sustainable societies that are based on capitalism?
Okay. First one. Yep. Look, the heroes, in my way of thinking, there's quite a few of them. They're not household names. Firstly, Herman Daly springs to mind. He died this year. He was one of the founders of the steady state economy movement. So he was a loss. Others are doing really good work in and around that and close to that. They're not all, in my view, they haven't got it all together, but who am I to say? I'm just little old Martin from Browley. But Kate Raworth is an Oxford professor who's developed donut economics, which clearly defines planetary limits and the space that we should be operating in. And she's having a lot of success. Kate Raworth, that's Raworth, and donut economics. People can look that up, see what she's doing. Timothy Parikh is a French guy that's a younger guy, and it's good to see some younger faces instead of us old blokes all the time. By the way, I'm a little bit older than you, I think, judging by if you were in year 11 in 1982. So, yeah, there's a few of them. They're not household names, obviously, because they're not going to get reported in mainstream media because mainstream media stick to the script. You can get out there and search for them. If people go and look for those people, Timothy Parikh, I think it's P-A-I-C-Q-I-Q-U-E. He's pretty good. Jason Hickel, a writer for The Guardian, talks about degrowth a fair bit, although he is one of those that, in my way of thinking, lacks the courage to tackle the population component of it, which must be part of it. But yeah, there's a few of them. Now, the other thing you asked was about capitalism, correct?
Yeah. Just wondering whether a sustainable global society, I don't really want to call it an economy, but can we get to a sustainable carrying capacity and a situation where people are living lives that they no longer have to aspire to greatly improve, if you get what I'm meaning, if that most people feel like they have the stuff they need? Is that compatible with capitalism?
Well, it's certainly not compatible with what the capitalism gone mad that we've got now, where basically the whole world's been turned over to just full-on capitalism. I myself am a small business person all my life. I see a role, if you call that capitalism, at a smaller scale, community businesses, community enterprises. That's a small scale. I think my point is,
I have to stop you there just on a definitional thing. The minute that you call an enterprise a community enterprise, it's then stepped outside of capitalism, hasn't it? It's still buying and it's still trading, but hasn't it shifted more into the sphere of socialism rather than capitalism the minute that we attach community to it?
I guess that's the point I was going to make, is that in my view, we don't go from one extreme, capitalism, to extreme the other way, socialism. Not 100%. I think the middle ground, the balance, it's all about everything's about balance. And if we can combine entrepreneurial spirit, which kind of, they say, drives capitalism and so on a smaller scale, and work that into community enterprises, and even just in pure small scale, small business, capitalistic type small business enterprises. But balanced against that, there needs to be that social community side of things. And what I'm worried about at the moment is that we're seeing this huge backlash against this failed extreme form of capitalism where it's basically running the world, which is very dangerous. And people are just shifting so far left that all they're going to do is concentrate wealth and power at the other end of the spectrum and swing straight past the sweet spot. And to me, that sweet spot is the balance. It's balance with nature, balance between community and between labor and capital. It's just something that the human race just does not seem to be able to get its head around at the moment, that the most powerful state is a balanced state. And we just seem to love extremes. And that's what worries me at the moment, is that I'm seeing extremism the other way. So we run the risk of going, and then when that extreme fails, then we'll swing back the other extreme. And somewhere in the middle is a place where we can thrive. And that's Kate Raworth's message. And it's the message of the degrowth movement, and about the whole concept of bringing things back to a sustainable scale where new goals can be set and people's lives can be improved, genuinely sustainable. The word gets thrown around too much these days, things that aren't, that every sustainability is a function of scale more than anything else. Nothing is sustainable past a certain point in terms of human enterprise, human activity. I think the point you make is a good one. I think the real situation, the best situation, is that balance between community, enterprise, somewhere in the middle there.
You mentioned the reporter, I think, was it The Guardian, who I think you mentioned his testicular fortitude, because he doesn't tackle the population matter. And that seems to be the difficult thing for anyone to talk about when we venture into this space. So is there a number on the carrying capacity for a sustainable spaceship Earth that is generally accepted in this field?
No is the short answer. And again, it comes back to how people want to live. If everyone wants to have a big house and a big car, and it depends on how they want to live. If everyone wants to live as the top 5% on the planet do, then the carrying capacity is probably about 800,000 or 900,000, to be brutally honest. If everyone's willing to accept a middle class life, the sums I've seen would put it at more like 2 to 3 billion. We're at 8 billion now. If you took the world's wealth and distributed evenly among all 8 billion on Earth, I think it amounts to about an income of around about $7,000 or $8,000 per annum US dollars. So that's basically poverty. So in such numbers, even distribution of wealth would place everyone in poverty. People don't like to talk about it because I think they've been made not to talk about it. When I was growing up, it was talked about. Martin Luther King spoke about it. People sang about it. Pete Seeger sang about it. It was part of the early environmental movements was all about the population issue. And the Green Revolution came along, and instead of using that to make sure everyone was well fed and we had a nice, healthy Earth, it was used to drive population up. Population drives markets. It drives profits. It creates a surplus of labour to jobs such that capital controls labour. And then there's the issue of cultural practices in a lot of countries and religious practices that encourage that, either through historical habits or, in a way you could argue, many religions are basically businesses in the business of gathering souls. And the more souls you have, the bigger your business. It's a very complicated issue, and I understand why people are reluctant to talk about it because it's been made toxic. Insults are thrown around, but really it's something that for the sake of humanity and the sake of the planet, it has to be included in sustainability discussions because it relates back to scale. And as I said, sustainability is as much a function of scale as it is of what you're doing, whether it be green energy, renewable energy, or whatever it may, electric cars, whatever it may be. At a certain scale, it all becomes unsustainable and damaging. So it is a complicated subject, and I've been abused plenty of times for talking about it, but it has to be talked about, and it has to be talked about without racial implications or all the nasty stuff. And sorry to go on a bit here, but
I think you've really hit on something which is why it's hard and why people don't hunt it.
I think there's one more important point, if I could just make it. First.
Sure.
If rational, ethical people from an ecological and an economic perspective are bullied off the population topic, you leave that ground open for people to exploit it for ugly agendas, be it racism, be it whatever it may be. The ground is left bare. And if we don't occupy it with sensible arguments and sensible policies and discussions, then it's there for who knows who's going to extreme right wing, or someone's going to step in and harness the discontent around that's causing for what I'd call pretty ugly agendas.
You just used the word unethical, and I prefaced our discussion, I think, by saying how difficult it is for people to actually front the issues. I think that in terms of the discussion we're having now, I think that any family that owns more than 2 cars, if there are less than, let's say, 6 people in the house, I think in the context of this discussion, that becomes unethical. And I think that anyone who owns more than 1 home or 1 suitable dwelling is also pursuing ethical practice.
Yep. I think the whole system drives unethical practices in all sorts of ways.
So how do we gain allies when those people that we know who are not bad people and in other ways are pursuing good things, but they feel that they need to be gathering wealth? We really struggle with this whole idea of heredity, passing on wealth to the next generation. I find it unbelievable that people can inherit a house from their parents and then with a straight face be talking to me at a barbecue about how they're self-made, how they've worked really hard to achieve what they have. And I say, look, piss off, dickhead. You got given something in the mid-'80s that was worth $750,000. How do you reckon you're self-made, dickhead? But I'm obviously a radical, but how do you bring people to the cause when it means that they have to reflect on the life they live, especially if they spout good stuff about human rights and everything and wanting to help people in other countries and everything, but not prepared to take a backward step in terms of the damage they do themselves in their own, on the exact spot where they stand.
Yeah, look, as you say, good people, but they're victims of the propaganda. They're victims of the system because to them, they're doing nothing wrong. And people who are acquiring multiple investment properties or even going out and spending big at Christmas time, it's like on useless toys, they're going to get thrown away. It's good for the economy. And again, it comes back to the economic system and the goals of the economy that's aiming perpetual growth, just wants you to go every year to go out and buy more Christmas presents and throw them in the landfill and buy another lot next year. So the system is encouraging wrong behaviours. But look, all I can say in terms of changing people's attitudes is just to keep a tight message around what's wrong and what we need to do and just keep plugging it away. What I'm hoping is maybe some higher profile people will come on board and lend weight to this sort of movement, because at the moment, the movement's there, the degrowth movement and steady state economy movement are there. It's simmering away at a low level, but with the right, if someone maybe high profile or get a few people involved with it, maybe money, I don't know, but it could explode. It could explode very quickly. It's all there. All the ingredients are there. So we've just got to be patient and just keep people who see what's going on and see the need for change. I think have just got to be patient and work hard. There's no substitute for hard work.
Is attaching yourself to the term degrowth too toxic for people with a high public profile?
That's a really good question because people say it's a terrible word and it's very descriptive. I say the word degrowth is what you get when you put economists in the marketing department because it's not a particularly easy sell, degrowth versus growth. I wish someone had a better term.
Yep. I like steady state economy, and I wonder whether it can be tied up with the new movement or the new theories in monetary policy, that the two could go hand in hand, that we could move away from old school economic thinking. But I don't know, steady state economy seems to me to be something that people could latch onto.
Yeah, I think so. But even then, steady state implies people read into it stagnation and, we're not growing, we're not developing, we're not advancing. It's still I don't have a better word, but unfortunately, the interests in the current economic paradigm got in first and chose all the good words to attach to their system. They've chosen progress and development. A developer is someone who bulldozes the bush and whacks in a housing estate that generates no wealth for the country, but they're a developer. And if you're anti that, you're anti-progress. And they've attached all these these nice labels, the really marketable labels, to what they're destructive, parasitic forms of development or growth. Yeah, look, marketing and branding is a problem for us. Degrowth describes the process, but you don't always get a lot of support describing the process. So it's difficult. I don't know. I just keep plugging away.
Let's go back. I can't let the parasite comment go. Fill me in on who you consider to be the parasites and which behaviours in particularly emblematic of being a parasite.
My favourite Parasite of the Year award goes to the lobby because to me, they're generating no wealth for the country. They create jobs, but they're only short-term jobs. And the way I describe it is if you build a housing estate to create jobs for people, then once that's built, the next estate has to be bigger to cater for the people that are living there now, plus the people needed to build the new one. So you've just got to keep building more. It's just a parasitic, it's a cancerous type process across the land. So anything that's not really generating wealth for the country or doing some sort of community good is, I would call, parasitic. And they're my main ones. Like really, and when you're looking at it from purely economic point of view, the retail of consumer goods, all these big hardware chains and things and retail outlets that are opening up, they're sucking in imports and selling consumer goods into the marketplace. Most of the products aren't even made here. So they're not really contributing much to the economy. And the form of growth required to keep their business model going is actually parasiting the economy. So in a sense, economic growth itself is the biggest parasite because it is parasiting the land in order to maintain its growth. It itself is a cancer. And so in terms of parasitic, what isn't parasitic are things like community gardens, small local business that put back into the economy, things that may be value add, manufacturing. We used to make washing machines and things here that we could sell to our own people, creating jobs, taking our raw materials and improving their value rather than just shipping them all overseas. Those sort of things are not, in my view, not parasitic, actually contributors to the economy. In a sense, there's the parasites and the non-parasites. So maybe a little bit of a sliding scale, but on the extreme end, you've got your consumerist interests and your property money lenders, rent seekers and so on. To me, they're the parasites.
Can we unwind it? Sometimes I think that the only way we're going to get change is if there's an absolute catastrophe somewhere, that the of the global economy might need to happen to unwind it. Can you see a way without catastrophe where we can actually make the change that is required to move away from a consumption-based economy where it's not only the wealth, it's also the decisions are made by so few people?
Yeah. And look, we are going through a catastrophe now. People say, when's the catastrophe going to happen? To me, who's in tune with the land and nature and people like you with birds and stuff, you can see the catastrophe unfolding now. It's not going to it may accelerate as we go along and be just totally disguisable, but the catastrophe is already happening. But unfortunately, those that are making money from business as usual are doing their level best to make sure we're distracted, building new football stadiums and raising issues to get the public excited that don't challenge the fundamentals of our economy. So can I see it happening? I don't know. I hope so. And I have to work on that belief because collapse is a very ugly thing. People suffer, die, starve. Our environment's already plundered, but when people get desperate, it can be completely wiped out. So I don't know. It's a difficult battle because there's a lot of denial out there. There's still a lot of faith that the solution to the problems caused by growth is more growth, and they control the narrative. They control the media. How we crack through that, I really don't know. I don't know. I like to think that something will happen. Some great leader will emerge and speak sense, but I don't know where we're going to go with all this.
When was the last time you heard degrowth being talked about seriously on any mainstream media? And by mainstream, I'll include the ABC. I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about it seriously. I've only ever heard it sort of spat out like bile by some conservative economist or a conservative politician looking for a way to tag someone or someone's view as being illegitimate.
No.
Is there anything that we can look up, like a segment on any current affairs show or a Sunday magazine style program or anything where anyone's ever gone into the ramifications for all of us?
No, not that I'm aware of. I'm going to try and get myself on Q&A maybe, but I don't know. I don't know of anything. And what they do is they keep promoting these ideas such as green growth and techno fixes. The next technological fix is just around the corner so that growth can be sustained. And this fantasy gets perpetuated. As they say, green growth is a complete oxymoron, but you'll see that, but you'll never see degrowth on mainstream media. And you're right to include ABC because they totally fail to challenge the system. They just become patsies in my view.
Yeah. Did you see the story? It cropped up in my news feed yesterday, I think, about the complete failure of the magic meat, the meat substitute market. And the article was written that moving away from meat has been a complete failure. But it was only a failure because someone tried to commodify it and they got a whole heap of angel investors, raised hundreds of millions of dollars on Wall Street to promote meat substitutes. But nowhere in the discussion was there how simple it is to move away from meat. I've done it, and I'm not a card-carrying vegan or anything. I just started eating tofu. And
Yeah,
once I started eating it,
personally, I've tried it. Maybe I don't know how to cook it, but I haven't quite got my head around tofu yet.
I just started chopping it into chunks and putting it in a stir fry. Then I started making other things out of it, but basically I use it in curry and everything, but it didn't require any sort of drastic shift in my life other than going to the supermarket and not only tofu, but I buy lentils and there's all sorts of colors. But I just really stopped buying meat and fish. That's the decision I made.
Yeah.
That's the only decision I made.
Yeah. There are lots of actions like that we need to take, and they're good actions. But the problem is people take them in the context of economic growth. Like, will we do this and suddenly the world will become sustainable? We all become vegan, or if we all buy electric cars, or, there's a recipe coming up there. I'll make note of that. But
we'll talk recipes after this.
Yeah. What I'm getting at is that there's a lot of these things to reduce personal ecological footprint is really important. That's a huge part of degrowth, but it needs to be done in the context of economic degrowth, not in the context of this is how we sustain growth, because I don't know if you're aware of Javon's paradox. So basically it states that whenever you make a technological advancement to look after the environment, growth consumes it. It's used as a stepping stone to more growth. And
that's basically the same as if you widen the road to reduce congestion, you'll just get more congestion over time.
Yeah. So then you put more cars on the road.
That's right.
More growth.
That's right. You create more space.
Yeah. That's what it is. And look, so the idea of all these, a lot of technologies that hold a lot of potential, and food habits and spending habits, they're good, but I'm just saying that people need to do it. If they're going to tweet it, put #veganism, #degrowth. Just please put degrowth in all your sustainability, steady state, #steady state. I've also used degrowth to steady state as another hashtag, implying that degrowth's not a perpetual process, but just a process to come back to sustainable scale. Yeah, look, you can do all those things, but it's the context. It's the overarching goal, whether it be growth or degrowth. There are our two choices. If we think growth's going to solve our problems, then stick with the status quo. If you think degrowth's going to solve your problems, then, or at least help make it easier to solve the problems, then follow people like Steady State Economy, Centre for the Advancement of Steady State Economy, Sustainable Population Australia, organisations that are actively challenging growth. There's a few of them out there once you start searching.
So I'll get Martin to send me the links for all the people that he thinks is worth following up and the hashtags to use, because if we all start using them, they might catch up. Martin, final thing I want to ask, and it's possibly just rephrasing the same and driving home the same point, but it seems to me to be a marketing challenge in a way to get people to move to these thoughts. I can see why the captains of industry and the real vested interests who own most of the resources are always going to demonize it. But how do we make the concept less threatening for just average people? Because it's always couched in, for us to achieve degrowth or sustainable living. I almost fell for it. I almost said sustainable development, but sustainable living without it being a threat to the well-being of the individual and their family.
Yeah, but it's a bit like what we touched on earlier. First things first is to make people understand that the current system is failing, and you've only got to look at climate change and biodiversity loss and all of this stuff. So if you're objective and stop soaking up all the propaganda, you'll see that the system is failing. So we do need to change. Secondly, you need to understand what degrowth is. It's simply the economics term for carefully reducing the scale and impact of the economy, the process of finding balance, harmony and resilience as a sustainable platform from which to pursue genuine progress. I like to think of it as degrowth for regrowth, or another one which I've used in the past is #redefining growth, as in, for example, ecosystem health would be an area of growth. So I think that just stick to that tight message. And I don't know what beyond that we can do, especially with my meager resources and non-existent profile. We just get out there and do what we can.
What's the time frame that we've got to operate in? To me, the problem seems urgent. How long have we got to turn the Titanic around?
20 years ago, we should have started. 30 years ago. Look, it's, as I say, it's never too late to change. And we've got certain problems locked in now. And the longer we leave it, the worse those problems will be. So the time frame is today, tomorrow, but that doesn't mean that if nothing happens to tomorrow, you give up, because we're down the track. Even if it's next year, if we can make some significant changes or some breakthroughs, it won't be as bad as if we didn't make them next year. It really is super urgent, but sometimes if you stress the urgency, people feel like they don't see anything happening, so they give up. So I just say, don't give up. We can always make a difference to the trajectories, the paths we're on, but the sooner the easier it will be and the less awful will be the consequences.
Or as I like to say, it will be a smaller shit sandwich that we have to have. The outcome will be less shit.
Yes.
So follow Martin on Medium, medium.com/@MartinRev21. And of course, the Facebook group that we talked about earlier on is Sustainable Population Australia. I'll include in the post on thebirdemergency.com/degrowth. When I get it up, I'll put the hashtags and that Martin thinks that we could all push up. Maybe we'll get degrowth is your friend or something can become a trending hashtag alongside the latest Elon fail or Scott Morrison trending. Who knows? Martin, thanks for joining us all on the Bird Emergency. I hope you've all found the conversation useful. Think about it the next time you're in the food aisles at the supermarket, and while you are blithely sucking in all that propaganda, when you're getting the economic segment where you're finding out how oil did overnight on the markets or what the Nick is doing, just understand that it's all shit. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Grant.
Well, bird nerds, you've made it this far. I guess that means you're pretty into the show. That's a very good thing, and I appreciate it. But I really, really would appreciate it if you visited thebirdemergency.com/coffee, because, with all the inflation and stuff, coffee's getting expensive. See you, bird nerds.